You were never meant to hear this. Not from me. Not from anyone. The walls of Blackridge Abbey have been silent for more than 200 years. Not because there is nothing to tell, but because what happened here was designed to die with those who lived it. The history books give you the same 3 lines. A religious order founded in 1784, dissolved in 1807 after internal disputes. But that is a lie. A very polite lie. The kind institutions use when the truth would burn down the very idea of faith, authority, and order. I am not here to entertain you. I am here to take you into the vault. The vault of history they've buried beneath sermons, beneath charity ledgers, beneath Latin prayers whispered by trembling mouths. You're about to learn why the Silent Sisters never spoke again, and why every man who tried to make them talk disappeared before sundown. Picture it. An abbey on the far edge of the Blackridge cliffs, where the wind sounds like a human cry and the sea beats against the rock as if trying to claw its way inside. Behind the great oak doors, candlelight dances on stone walls. But it's not the light that matters. It's the shadow. And the shadow in Blackridge Abbey didn't come from the candles. The sisters called themselves the keepers of the veil. Not a title of humility, but of dominion. They believed they guarded a threshold, not to heaven, but to something older. Something that had nothing to do with salvation. Men from the surrounding villages said the nuns would vanish for days into the lower crypts, returning with strange burns on their hands and a look in their eyes that made grown men turn away. By the time the king's inspectors came in 1807, the abbey was empty. Not abandoned, empty. No bodies, no belongings, no sign of departure. Just rows of pews still warm, as if they had been sat in seconds before. And on the altar, a single black veil, folded with military precision. You are here now, not because the story is rare, but because the truth is dangerous. Once you hear it, you can't unhear it. They didn't leave the abbey. The abbey kept them. The official reports, what little survived, read like a script written by men who feared what they'd seen. Inspectors spoke in circles, never stating directly what was in front of them. One wrote in the margin of a confiscated ledger, "The air tastes wrong here." Another scrawled a single sentence before his report cut off mid-ink. They were still here, but unseen. Understand this. The Silent Sisters weren't bound by vows of poverty, chastity, or obedience. Those were illusions for outsiders. Their true vow was to the order beneath, an unbroken chain of women trained not in scripture, but in silence. Not silence as absence of speech, silence as a weapon. The kind of silence that breaks the will of any man who dares to stand before it. For decades, Blackridge Abbey was a beacon for the desperate and the damned. Sick men, dying soldiers, widowers clawing at the edge of madness, all found their way to the sisters. And when they left, if they left, they were changed. Some became devout, almost feverishly so. Others withdrew from the world entirely, refusing to speak of what they'd seen. And a few didn't leave at all. In the archives of the Royal Constabulary, there's a set of sketches, crude charcoal renderings of the Abbey's lower chambers. Staircases that twist into impossible angles. Doorways built for bodies taller than any human. One room, described only as the mouth, was said to have walls that pulsed, faintly, as if something within was breathing. The sisters claimed it was where they took confession. No man who entered it was ever seen again. But the most unsettling detail, every sister was accounted for in the Abbey's own meticulous rolls. Birth dates, initiation rites, duties performed. Yet not a single death record exists. Not one grave. Not one memorial stone. Over the span of 23 years, the Abbey cycled through 53 sisters, and none of them died. You need to start asking yourself, what does an institution want so badly to protect that it erases not just the evidence, but the very memory? The answer lies deeper, beneath the Abbey, beneath the stone, beneath the history you were taught. And once we go there, you will never think of silence the same way again. You've heard the saying, if walls could talk. But here's the truth they never tell you. Some walls don't speak because they're keeping a secret. Others don't speak because they're listening. In the winter of 1796, a stonemason named Harlan Crow was commissioned to repair a collapse in the abbey's eastern wing. He lasted 3 days. On the 4th, he left before dawn, abandoning his tools, his pay, and his reputation. In the statement his family forced him to write, under pressure from the local magistrate, he said nothing more than, "The stone is not stone. It hears." That sentence was quietly removed from the official record. But a private copy, hidden in the estate archives of the Crow family, adds another line. "And when it hears you, it learns you." Blackridge Abbey was never designed to be a sanctuary. It was a chamber, a vessel for something older than any Christian faith. The sisters did not serve God. They served the architecture itself. They tended it, fed it, kept it alive. And in return, it gave them something men have killed and built empires for. The oldest surviving journal from within the abbey, dated 1789, written in an archaic blend of Latin and Old Saxon, describes the second voice. The author claims that after a year in service, a sister could speak without moving her lips, her words carried through the stone, directly into the mind of another. No one outside the order could resist it. A whisper could become a command. A command could become law. Now think about the power in that. A woman, unseen, shaping your thoughts from the shadows of a chapel wall, making you kneel when you meant to run, making you confess sins you never committed, making you willing. That's why the men in power protected the abbey for so long. Not because of faith, but because the sisters were an invisible weapon. A weapon no soldier could see coming. But weapons, in time, turn on their masters. And when the turning began, the men outside the walls were the last to know. By the summer of 1807, the abbey was more fortress than convent. The gates, once open to the poor, stayed locked at all hours. Deliveries of food, wine, and candles were left at the threshold, taken inside only when no one was watching. And the bells, the great iron bells that had rung for decades, fell silent. The villagers called it the season without sound. The first sign that something was wrong came from a merchant named Bramble Price. He claimed to have seen his sister at the cliff's edge at dawn, her veil torn away, her hair unbound, staring into the sea as if listening to it. "She didn't blink," he told the magistrate. "Not once. And I swear the tide stopped moving." 2 days later, strange lights appeared in the abbey's upper windows. Not firelight, something colder, shifting in colors no one could name. The fishermen who saw it refused to go back to those waters. One said the light looked like it could burn your thoughts out of your skull. Then came the night of August 14th. A storm rolled in from the west, the kind that makes the land feel like it's holding its breath. Lightning struck the abbey twice, but the second strike didn't fade. Witnesses say it stayed, crawling down the walls in veins of blue light. And through the rain, people swore they heard voices. Not prayers, not chants, but single words repeated in a rhythm that made the hair on your arms rise. A language no one knew, but every man understood in the same way, as a command. By dawn, the storm was gone. The abbey's gates were open, and the silent sisters were gone. The king's men searched every floor, every hall, every crypt. Nothing. Not a veil. Not a shoe. Not a single drop of blood. Just one thing left behind, in the center of the chapel floor, carved deep into the stone. A spiral, so precise it looked machined, turning inward until it vanished into a hole too small for a finger, but too deep for a torch to find the bottom. The inspector's final note was brief. If the stone can hear, then this is where it speaks back. The disappearance of 53 women should have triggered a nationwide hunt. It didn't. The official story, printed in small columns in provincial papers, read, "Order dissolved. Members dispersed." The lie was almost insulting in its laziness. But a handful of men knew better. The first was Captain Elias Harrow, a retired naval officer who had supplied the abbey with salted fish for over a decade. He knew their routines, their appetite, their preference for barrels sealed in wax instead of pitch. When the abbey went silent, he didn't believe they had simply walked away. Harrow recruited 2 others, Dr. Ansel Ward, a physician with a taste for the arcane, and Fletcher Gant, a smuggler who knew every hidden path along the Blackridge cliffs. They met in secret, in the back room of the Anchor's Rest Tavern, and made a pact. They would enter the abbey at night, find proof of where the sisters had gone, and bring it back to light. What happened next was pieced together only from Ward's journal, recovered years later from a locked trunk in his nephew's attic. His handwriting was sharp at first, clinical, but as the pages go on, the lines slant, the ink pools, and his sentences begin to break apart. Ward writes of a smell that clung to the air inside the abbey. Not decay, but something like copper and rain. He describes the walls as wet in places, though no water falls, and the sense that something was breathing behind them. They descended into the lower crypts, passing empty cells and chapels where candles burned without melting. And then they found it. A door of solid black stone, set deep into the earth, with no hinges and no handle. Only the same spiral carved into its surface. Harrow touched it first. Ward writes that the moment his hand met the stone, he froze, not in fear, but in obedience. His eyes went wide, his lips moved, but no sound came out. Fletcher tried to pull him away. Harrow didn't move. He stayed there, palm pressed to the spiral, until the black stone slowly opened. Ward's last entry ends here. The page is wet, the ink smeared. Only 3 words are legible at the bottom. They were waiting. You need to understand, doors are not just barriers. In places like Blackridge Abbey, they're choices. Once opened, they don't close the same way again. Ward's journal gives us nothing beyond they were waiting, but Fletcher Gant's account, told years later in a whisper to a dying priest, fills in the void. According to him, the black stone door didn't swing or slide. It peeled like skin from muscle, folding backward into the wall with a sound that was not mechanical, but alive. Behind it was no chamber, at least not in the human sense. Fletcher said it felt like stepping into a throat. The walls curved and rippled, glistening as if slick with oil, but dry to the touch. The air was heavy, pressing into the lungs, and there was light, but it came from nowhere. And then the singing began. It wasn't in a language he knew, but every note felt like it was naming him, stripping pieces of him away. Fletcher claimed he could see the sound, forming shapes in the air, long, dark ribbons that curled through the space and wrapped themselves around Harrow and Ward. Their faces went slack, their eyes emptied, and they began to move forward, deeper in, without a single step of hesitation. That's when he saw them. The Silent Sisters. Not gone, not aged, but standing in 2 lines, each with their hands folded and heads bowed, as if in prayer. Their veils were gone, their skin pale as salt, and their eyes black. Not from pupil to iris, but from lid to lid. Fletcher swore they were not breathing, that their stillness was perfect, but when Harrow and Ward reached them, the sisters lifted their heads in unison, and they smiled. Then came the voice, not from one mouth, but from all of them at once. A single thought pressed directly into Fletcher's skull. One has come to watch. The sisters stepped aside, revealing the spiral once more, this time carved into the floor. It turned slowly, as if the stone itself was rotating, pulling downward into an opening that was far too deep and far too dark. And then Harrow stepped in. The spiral wasn't a staircase in the way you understand it. It was smooth, almost polished, and yet Harrow's feet found grip as if the stone itself wanted him to descend. He didn't look back, didn't blink. Fletcher said it was as if the man had been claimed, his body no longer his own. Ward followed him, not like a friend chasing another, but like a moth pulled into flame. Fletcher hesitated at the edge, his instincts clawing at him to run, but the spiral moved beneath his feet, tilting ever so slightly, as if the abbey itself was leaning him forward. He slipped, and that was enough. Down they went. The light from above didn't fade as it should have. It clung, following them like a pale shadow, illuminating walls etched with countless spirals, some barely the size of a coin, others large enough to crawl into. Within each spiral were markings, not words, not pictures, but shapes that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. After what felt like hours, they reached the bottom. The floor was a mirror, not glass, not water, a sheet of black stone so perfect it reflected their faces in painful detail. Harrow stepped forward and his reflection didn't match him. It smiled before he did. Then the ground breathed. A slow, deep inhale. The reflections rippled, pulling outward from the center, until the blackness gave way to something that wasn't stone at all. Fletcher swore it was an eye. Enormous, lidless, its surface shimmering with colors that made his teeth ache. It looked at them, not with curiosity, but with recognition. The sisters began to hum above, their voices weaving together into that same unholy melody. The spiral on the floor began to rotate faster, and the black eye opened wider. Harrow dropped to his knees. His reflection reached out of the mirror, its hands pale and too long, gripping his shoulders. Ward tried to pull him back, but the reflection took him too, yanking both men downward into that impossible depth. Fletcher stood frozen. The hum grew louder. The eye blinked once, and in that blink, both men were gone. Only then did Fletcher realize the Abbey had never been feeding on prayer. It had been feeding on people. Fletcher did what every instinct told him. He ran. Up the spiral, his hands scraping against the cold curves of the wall, his boots striking sparks on the stone. The hum from above became a roar, the sisters' voices merging into something so low it rattled his bones. He didn't dare look back. Halfway up, the light changed. It was no longer the pale, colorless glow from before. It was red. Not fire red, but the deep, wet red of blood and water. The walls seemed to close around him, narrowing, pressing his shoulders until he could barely move. And then the voices stopped. It was worse than the roar. The silence was absolute, the kind that made him hear his own heartbeat like a drum in his skull. Fletcher slowed. His breath turned shallow, and in that stillness came the whisper. Not in his ears, in his head. The same voice Harrow must have heard when he touched the stone door. Soft, patient, certain. You've been seen. You cannot leave unseen. He bolted. The narrowing walls opened just enough for him to pass, but his legs felt heavy, like the air itself was pulling him down. He burst through the black stone doorway, or what was left of it. It had closed behind him, smooth as a tomb wall. The crypt above was empty. The candles that had been burning when they entered were now cold stubs. He raced through the corridors, but the Abbey seemed wrong. The halls twisted, familiar turns leading to dead ends. Windows looking out onto walls of stone instead of the cliffs. When he finally reached the great oak doors, they were wide open. Outside, the air was sharp and cold, the night sky littered with stars. He stepped over the threshold and stopped, because there in the field beyond were the sisters, all 53, standing in a perfect circle, facing inward. He couldn't see what they surrounded. He didn't want to. The whisper came again. To leave is to carry. Fletcher ran past them, not daring to look, not daring to hear more. He didn't stop until the Abbey was a shadow behind him. But in the years that followed, he learned the truth of that warning, because the whisper never left. Fletcher Gant left Blackridge Abbey in body, but not in mind. He returned to the coastal town of Kinnaway, told no one where he'd been, and swore never to set foot near the cliffs again. But the people there knew something had changed. His eyes darted at sounds no one else heard. His sleep was restless, full of sudden jolts and muttered words in languages no fisherman could name. 3 weeks after his return, Fletcher began to dream of the spiral. Not the one carved into the door or the floor, but one that appeared in the air above his bed, turning slowly, calling him downward. Each time he woke, he would find his feet dirty, as if he'd walked barefoot through soil in the night. The voice, that voice, stayed with him. Sometimes it whispered, coaxing him toward the cliffs. Sometimes it commanded, bending his will in ways he could not resist. On one occasion, it told him to go to the market and purchase 3 specific items: a length of black ribbon, a jar of salt, and a small mirror. He obeyed without question until he caught his own reflection in that mirror and saw the truth. It wasn't his face. Not entirely. The eyes were wrong, black from lid to lid, just like theirs. Fletcher smashed the mirror, but shards followed him for weeks, turning up at his pockets, his boots, even between the pages of his Bible. And no matter where he found them, they always reflected that same black-eyed version of himself. Then the disappearances began. People Fletcher spoke to at length, a dock worker, a barmaid, a traveling merchant, were simply gone within days. No signs of struggle, no farewells. Only silence. He knew what had taken them. The Abbey didn't need walls anymore. It had him. By the spring of 1808, Fletcher stopped speaking entirely. Those who saw him said he'd stand for hours at the pier, staring at the horizon as if waiting for a ship that would never come. And sometimes they swore they heard him humming that same low, unholy melody. Fletcher had escaped the Abbey stones, but the Abbey had learned to move through him. It started quietly. A sailor docked in Kinnaway claimed he'd met a man in the tavern with strange eyes, black and endless, who spoke without moving his lips. A month later, that sailor's ship returned to port without him, or the other 3 crewmen who'd been drinking with him that night. In Carlisle, a priest was found kneeling in the street at midnight, whispering to the cobblestones. His parishioners said he'd been a good man once, but lately, he'd stopped using the pulpit to speak of God. Instead, he spoke of returning. He spoke of the spiral beneath the skin. He was taken in for questioning. He did not resist. He only smiled. And in London, far from the cliffs, far from the Abbey, a banker began to paint spirals on the inside of his eyelids with lampblack, so he would see them every time he blinked. He told his wife it was so she would never be alone when she entered. She left him within a week. He was found dead 2 days later, the floor beneath him carved into a pattern no one recognized, except Fletcher. Fletcher never admitted to knowing them, never claimed connection. But the pattern was clear. Every man infected by the Abbey's influence had crossed paths with Fletcher Gant in the months following his return. And then came the letters. Unsigned, unstamped, slipped under doors in the dead of night. They contained only 2 things, a small black ribbon and a single sentence written in a hand that seemed older than paper itself. The sisters are walking. The authorities called it hysteria, folklore, superstition. But the men who had seen it, who had felt it, knew better. They began to gather in hidden places, sharing their stories in whispers. Every account ended the same way, with that melody, that humming, always low, always beneath hearing, until it wasn't. Fletcher watched this from the shadows. He no longer tried to stop it. He knew the truth. The Abbey wasn't waiting for people to come to it anymore. It was moving outward. His name was Dalton Reeves, a mason from York. By all accounts, he was an ordinary man, strong, methodical, and steady-minded, the sort you'd trust to build a wall that would stand for centuries. But in the autumn of 1808, Dalton began to dream of the sea, not the gentle swells he'd seen on holiday, but a black, roiling ocean under a moon that never moved. And over that sea, he heard the melody. At first, it was just a distant hum, something half buried under the sound of the waves. But as the nights went on, the hum grew louder and began to form into something like words. He could never remember them on waking, but he felt them deep in his chest, like a memory he'd forgotten to forget. 3 weeks later, Dalton quit his work, sold his tools, told his wife he had business on the coast. He kissed her once, smiled strangely, and left without luggage. Witnesses said they saw him walking barefoot along the North Road, his feet black with mud by the time he reached the cliffs of Blackridge. He was not seen again for 6 months. When Dalton finally returned to York, he did not go home. He was found sitting on the steps of the church at dawn, dressed in black, hands folded in his lap. The priest who approached him claimed Dalton's eyes were like the deep of a well. And when they asked him where he'd been, he answered without hesitation, "I went to serve." The priest pressed further. "Serve who? Serve how?" But Dalton would only smile, tilt his head, and begin to hum. The melody was so low it made the candle flames in the church tremble. Those who heard it described the sound as both beautiful and wrong. Dalton stayed in York for another week. Then he vanished again, but this time, others vanished with him. 6 men, all strong, all capable, all last seen in Dalton's company. A month later, a fisherman near Blackridge reported seeing figures on the cliff at night. Tall, rigid, all facing the Abbey. And among the black-cloaked silhouettes, One stood bareheaded, the moonlight catching a face they swore was Dalton Reeves. He was smiling. The night was windless when they came. 6 men followed Dalton along the narrow cliff path, each one silent, each one walking as if under a weight they couldn't see. The only sound was the steady hiss of the tide below, and somewhere within it, a thread of melody guiding their steps. The gates of Blackridge Abbey did not creak. They did not groan. They opened without sound, like the slow parting of lips before a secret is told. Inside, the air was heavy, not damp, but thick, as if it had been breathed too many times before. Candles lined the hall, their flames bending toward the men as they passed. Dalton said nothing. He didn't need to. The sisters were already there. They stood in the shadows, their faces hidden beneath black veils. The fabric was thin enough to reveal the faintest outlines of features. Lips unmoving, eyes fixed and unblinking. The recruits slowed, as though gravity itself had shifted around them. One man whispered a prayer. Another laughed nervously. Both were silenced with a single look from the veiled figures. Dalton led them to the central chamber. The spiral was there, carved deep into the stone floor, the grooves glistening with something that looked like oil but smelled faintly of salt and iron. The recruits were made to kneel around it. Then the humming began. It came from all directions at once, from the walls, the floor, the very air. It was the same melody that had drawn them here, but now it was fuller, layered, almost alive. One by one, the men's heads began to bow, eyes closed, bodies swaying. A sister stepped forward and produced a small silver blade, no longer than a finger. Without a word, she cut a line across the palm of each man, letting the blood fall into the spiral. The grooves drank it in. The humming grew louder. Dalton watched with a calm that was almost tender. When the last drop of blood was taken, the sisters turned and walked into the darkness beyond the chamber. The men followed without hesitation. None of them looked back. That was the night the Abbey claimed 6 more voices for its song. They descended in single file, the air growing colder with each step. The stone staircase wound downward like the inside of a seashell, and the only light came from the small lamps the sisters carried. Their flames blew, their glow swallowing more darkness than it revealed. At the bottom, the space opened into a chamber unlike the others. The walls here were not built by human hands. They curved inward, slick and pale, as if grown rather than carved. In the center stood a circular pit, its edges marked with spirals cut so deep the men could have hidden their hands inside them. Dalton stopped at the rim of the pit. The others joined him, peering over the edge. There was no bottom, only blackness, so pure it felt like it was pulling their eyes down. The humming had stopped. The silence was complete. A sister stepped forward and removed her veil. The men expected a face, but there was nothing, no mouth, no nose, only smooth, pale skin where features should have been. She knelt beside the pit, pressing her covered hands to its edge, and the blackness seemed to tremble in response. Dalton's voice was calm when he spoke. This is the well of silence. Here, words are traded for understanding, sound for obedience, voice for truth. One of the men laughed under his breath, but the sound died instantly, as though the air itself had swallowed it. The others stood frozen. The sister extended her hand toward the first recruit. Without knowing why, he took it. She pulled him forward until his face hovered over the blackness. Then, with a motion so fast it seemed impossible, she pressed her palm to his throat. He did not scream. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. His lips moved in panic, then slowed, then stilled. When she let go, he stepped back, touching his neck in horror, and smiling. Dalton beckoned the next man. One by one, they leaned over the well, and one by one, their voices were taken. No resistance, no questions, only silence. When the last man stepped back, the humming returned, but now it came from inside their chests, resonating without breath. They were no longer merely men. They were vessels. The humming guided them now, not the sisters. It pulsed through the walls like a heartbeat, leading them down a corridor that seemed too narrow, too low, as though the Abbey itself were forcing them to bow. The stone here was different, darker, slick with a sheen like wet obsidian. Every step echoed like a knock on a coffin lid. The hall ended at a door unlike any other in the abbey. It was not wood nor iron, but something pale and smooth like a single slab of bone. No hinges were visible. No handle. The sisters stopped. Dalton moved forward, placing both hands flat against the surface. The humming inside the men's chest began to synchronize with his movements. He pushed, and the bone door yielded, not swinging inward, but parting down the center like a rib cage opening. The chamber beyond was warm. Too warm. The air clung to their skin like breath. And in the center, half submerged in a pool of black water, was the mother below. She was vast, larger than any human could be. The curve of her back rose from the water like a hill of flesh, slick and glistening. Her hair, if it was hair, floated around her in long strands that moved without current. The sisters knelt as one, veils dipping into the water. A voice filled the room, but not through ears. It pressed directly into the mind. Deep, patient, ancient. Children, you have come empty. Good. The vessels felt their knees weaken. The voice was not loud, but it carried weight, the kind that bent the spine and hollowed the lungs. One man tried to look away. His gaze broke for only a moment, and in that moment, the mother below turned her head. She had no eyes, yet he froze as though caught in a gaze more piercing than sight. You will drink, the voice said. The sisters began filling bowls with the black water from the pool, pressing them into the hands of the vessels. The liquid was warm, almost thick. One by one, they drank. It tasted of salt and metal, and something else, something like memory. The mother below hummed in approval. Now you are mine. They were not led back up to the dormitories. Instead, the sisters took them deeper still, to a chamber with no torches, no candles. Only the faint glow of veins running through the stone like roots under skin. The air here was heavier, humid, carrying the faint scent of something sweet rotting. The vessels were told to lie down on the floor in a perfect circle, heads toward the center, feet pointing out. The stone beneath them was warm, as if something lived just beneath the surface. Dalton spoke only once. Sleep and listen. The humming from their chests began to change. It was slower now, deeper, until it matched the rhythm of a slow, steady breath. Not their own. In the darkness, the warmth spread from the stone into their spines, curling up into their skulls. Their eyelids grew heavy. And then the voice came. Not through the ears. Not like before. It slipped into the cracks between thought and dream, a whisper that seemed to echo from the inside of their bones. You are mine now. You will speak as I speak, see as I see. Your will is my vessel. Your hunger is my leash. Images flooded their minds. Black water flowing into mouths. Hands digging spirals into wet clay. Pale faces pressing close enough to feel breath that was not breath. And always, always, the spirals turning, drawing them inward. Something was placed in each of them. Not a thing they could touch, but a certainty like a single word carved into the deepest part of the mind. A word they could not read, but would obey without hesitation when it was spoken. One man jerked in his sleep, gasping. Another began to weep without sound. The rest lay still, their breathing synchronized, as if each chest rose and fell on the same invisible tide. When they woke, they remembered nothing of the dream. But their eyes were different now, not glassy, not dull, just still. Dalton looked upon them with quiet satisfaction. The seed is planted, he murmured. Now, you will grow into what you were meant to be. They woke to the sound of the bell, not the high chime of prayer, but the deep, resonant toll that rolled through the abbey like distant thunder. The sisters stood in the doorway, veils still damp from the night, and beckoned them without a word. Dalton was waiting in the courtyard. The air was thin, the sun pale and low, and the wind carried the faint smell of the moor beyond the walls. He did not greet them. He simply walked down the center path, and they followed, silent as the stones themselves. At the gates, the great wooden doors opened to the world outside. It was strange how quickly they had forgotten its sound, the chirp of birds, the distant rush of the river, the creak of the abbey's hinges. It all seemed smaller now. Dalton turned to them, eyes sharp, voice like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. "You will return before the next moon," he said. "Each of you will bring an offering." The word hung in the air, and though none asked what it meant, every man felt the same understanding coil in his chest. It was not gold. It was not bread. "Choose with care," Dalton continued. "What you bring will speak for you." One of the men swallowed hard, his Adam's apple twitching. Another stared at the ground, as though afraid the moor itself might hear him think. Dalton stepped closer to the youngest of them, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You will feel the pull," he said. "Follow it. It will lead you to the one you were meant to bring." And then he stepped back. The gates closed behind them, the heavy bar slamming into place. The wind was sharp now, cutting through their cloaks. Each man looked in a different direction, as though something unseen tugged at his spine. They did not speak. They did not need to. The humming was back, soft, guiding, and somewhere inside it was the word from their dreams, the one they could not remember, yet could never disobey. They began to walk. Separate paths, same destination. By the next moon, the abbey would have its offerings. The youngest vessel, Matthew, walked for 2 days before the pull stopped. It brought him to the edge of a small village, the kind that barely clung to the moors, its roofs sagging under the weight of time. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the scent of bread drifted faintly through the cold air. He had not eaten since leaving the abbey, yet hunger was not what gnawed at him. It was the other thing, the low thrum in his chest, urging him toward a specific door. A woman opened it before he could knock. She was older, with a face worn from years of wind and work. Her eyes met his, and the humming in his chest flared like a struck match. She frowned. "You're far from home, boy." Matthew's mouth opened. He expected to speak, to invent some lie. Instead, the words that came were not his. "The mother calls you." Her pupils dilated, her lips trembled, and then her shoulders slumped, as though the words had stolen something from her. She stepped aside, letting him in. Inside, the air was warm and dim. The smell of herbs hung heavy, masking something else beneath it, something like wet stone. She offered him bread. He did not eat. Instead, he reached into his cloak and pulled out the spiral-shaped brand the sisters had given him before he left. Cold iron, blackened at the tip. She saw it and began to cry. Not loudly, not pleading, just quiet tears, as though this had been waiting for her all her life. He set the brand in the fire. The metal hissed, and the scent of hot iron filled the room. She did not resist when he pressed it to the inside of her wrist. The flesh sizzled, the spiral burning into her skin. When he pulled it away, she kissed the mark, whispering words he did not know, yet somehow understood. That night, they walked back toward the moor together. She did not ask where they were going. The brand on her wrist glowed faintly in the moonlight, like an open eye. By dawn, they reached the abbey's gates. The sisters were waiting. The woman was taken without a word. 2 sisters stepped forward, their veils brushing the frost from the air, and one of them placed a long, bone-pale finger against Matthew's chest. "You wait." The gates closed behind them. He was left in the courtyard, the sound of their footsteps fading into the abbey's deeper corridors. Inside, the woman was led down a passage Matthew had never seen. The stone here was darker, polished smooth by centuries of hands, or something else, passing along its surface. The air grew warmer with each step, heavy with the scent of myrrh and something far sweeter, almost intoxicating. They stopped at a door of blackened oak. The spiral was carved deep into its center, ringed by words in a language no living tongue could form. The sisters opened it slowly, and the warmth spilled out like the breath of an animal. The chamber beyond was lit only by a single brazier in the center. Its smoke curled upward, vanishing into a ceiling so high it dissolved into shadow. Around the edges of the room, veiled figures knelt, their hands clasped, their bodies swaying gently as they hummed the same low, pulsing note Matthew had heard in his own bones. The woman was brought to the center and told to kneel. A voice emerged from the shadows, low, patient, each word spaced like it was being weighed. "You are not here to be saved. You are here to be emptied. The brazier's smoke thickened, filling her lungs with something that burned but did not choke. Her eyes widened, and she began to sway in rhythm with the kneeling figures. From the darkness, a figure emerged. Tall, thin. The veil covering its face was not cloth, but something translucent, stretched taut, with the faintest suggestion of features beneath. In its hands was a bowl carved from some dark, porous stone. It placed the bowl beneath her chin. The humming grew louder. Her body shuddered once, and then she began to speak. Not in her voice. Not in any voice that belonged to the living. Every word fell into the bowl like drops of black water. The offering had begun. They came for him at the third bell of the night. Not the high, urgent toll that summoned the masses, but the deep, singular note that belonged to no service he had ever known. Two sisters led him through the same blackened oak door he had glimpsed before. The air was warmer still, thick enough to taste. Every breath carried the sharp tang of iron, the sweetness of rotting fruit, and the bitter smoke of the brazier. The woman was there, kneeling in the center, her wrists bound loosely with a cord that looked more ceremonial than restraining. But her eyes were empty. They moved with the shadows, tracking something that wasn't in the room. Matthew's chest tightened. He could feel the humming again, but now it was no longer inside him. It was all around him, pressing in, resonating through the stone itself. The tall figure emerged once more, bowl in hand, and set it at the woman's knees. The liquid inside shimmered darkly, rippling though the air in the room was still. One of the kneeling sisters spoke first, in that same unbroken hum of a language he couldn't name. Another joined, then another. The woman began to convulse. Not violently, but like something was wringing her from the inside. Her mouth opened, and this time Matthew could hear it clearly, words spilling out, soaked in grief and fury, naming things he didn't know but somehow feared. The tall figure leaned forward, holding the bowl steady as the liquid inside began to lighten, from black to deep crimson, from crimson to a pale, iridescent gold. Matthew felt his knees weaken. The gold was alive. It pulsed with each word, as though the woman's voice had birthed something breathing. The humming stopped. The tall figure lifted the bowl and turned, not toward the altar, not toward the sisters, but toward him. It stepped close enough that he could see the shape of its hidden face, the faint gleam of teeth behind the veil. The bowl was held out. Drink, it said. And in that moment, he understood. The Abbey did not collect offerings to keep them. It collected them to harvest what could never be taken by force. The bowl was heavy in his hands, not because of its size, but because of what pulsed within it, a weight beyond flesh, beyond liquid, as though it contained the echo of an entire life. The gold shimmered faintly in the brazier's light, each ripple bending the shadows unnaturally. Matthew's fingers tightened around the stone rim. The tall figure did not move. No one in the chamber moved. Even the fire seemed to bow lower, as if waiting for his choice. He brought it to his lips. The first taste was not a taste at all. It was memory. Not his own, but the woman's. Her first love, the sin of the sea she once saw at 19, the day she buried her father under a black sky. The moments came all at once, tangled and jagged, flooding through him with no order, no mercy. The second taste was darker. Regret, betrayal, every silent rage she had swallowed because the world demanded her obedience. It burned like frost in his veins. By the third swallow, Matthew's body was no longer his own. His vision dimmed at the edges, yet what he saw became clearer. Symbols in the stone walls, breathing faintly. The faces beneath the veils, each one marked with spirals burned deep into the bone. The smoke curling into patterns that spoke in whispers he somehow understood. You are not drinking her life, the whispers said. You are drinking her surrender. The bowl emptied. His hands fell to his sides. His knees met the cold floor, but he felt no pain. The tall figure stepped forward, pressing the spiral brand, still glowing from the fire, against his bare chest. Flesh sizzled. The scent mingled with the brazier's smoke. But this was not a mark for others to see. The instant it touched him, the brand seared inward, a spiral curling through his thoughts, embedding itself in every corner of his mind. And there, beneath his own heartbeat, he felt it, a new rhythm, slow and heavy, not his but hers. He had not been initiated. He had been inhabited. That night he did not sleep, not because the abbey was restless, but because his mind no longer belonged solely to him. He lay in the narrow cell they had given him, stone walls on every side, a single slit of a window spilling pale moonlight across the floor. The brand on his chest still burned faintly, though the skin had cooled. At first, he thought it was his own pulse that kept him awake. Slow, deliberate, heavier than normal. But then he noticed it wasn't beating in time with his breath. It was beating in time with hers. No words, no voice, just an awareness that was not his, curling, patient, coiling through the dark corridors of his mind. And then the images began. They came like dreams, but sharper, every detail cruelly vivid. A hallway of doors, each marked with a spiral. A stone basin filled with water that did not reflect. A candle burning with a flame that bent away from the wick. Each image carried a pressure, a weight, as if urging him towards some unseen choice. He knew without understanding how. These were instructions. The sisters were not speaking to him in the language of the mouth. They were writing inside his thoughts. He tried to push back. He thought of the outside world, of the fields he had walked, of the smell of rain on the thatch roof of his childhood home. For a heartbeat, the rhythm faltered, and then the pressure surged. The brand on his chest flared hot, searing him from the inside out. His breath caught, and in that moment of weakness, a single thought bloomed in his mind. Not in his voice, not in any voice he knew, but as if carved directly into the core of him. You cannot unlearn us. His hands trembled. The moonlight seemed to bend, shrinking back from him. Even the cold air felt different, as if the abbey itself had leaned closer. By dawn, the rhythm had become natural, the images steady and precise. He was no longer resisting, not because he had accepted it, but because it had already made the choice for him. Morning came without sunlight. A pale haze clung to the air outside his cell, turning every surface in the abbey the color of ash. Matthew dressed in silence, forcing his thoughts into something mundane. The scrape of the fabric, the smell of damp stone, the slow ache in his knees from kneeling too long the night before. He told himself he would keep his mind empty, that if he thought nothing dangerous, nothing would happen. The first sister he saw that morning was sweeping the corridor. She did not look at him as he passed, yet her sweeping slowed, the straw bristles dragging across the flagstones in a slow spiral. The rhythm matched his heartbeat. By the time he reached the refectory, 3 sisters had passed him in silence. None had spoken. All had moved in ways that mirrored the pulse in his chest. At the long table, he sat among novices who whispered about their chores and the weather, but his focus was on the far end of the hall. There the tall figure stood, still veiled, still unmoving, watching him with that unbearable stillness. Matthew forced his gaze to the bowl in front of him. Porridge, bland, harmless, human. He thought of the market in the village, the smell of fresh bread, the sound of coins clinking, and then, like a knife slipping between ribs, another thought slid into his mind. You wish to leave. It was not a question. The spoon froze halfway to his mouth. He had not said it. He had not even fully formed it. But they had seen. A sister to his left stopped eating. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her head until the veil was angled toward him. Her hand reached under the table. A moment later, pain shot through his chest. Not from any blow, but from the brand itself, heating like molten metal. He gasped, and the novices around him fell silent. The tall figure at the end of the hall tilted its head, just slightly. Doubt is the seed of betrayal, the voice inside him said. We burn seeds here. The pain ebbed, but the rhythm in his chest quickened. And this time, Matthew did not try to slow it. He understood now. Even a single unguarded thought could be seen, felt punished. The abbey did not need walls to hold him. It had taken the prison inside. That it happened during the evening chant. The novices were kneeling in the main hall, the candles casting long, shivering shadows against the vaulted ceiling. The sisters formed a ring around them, veils shifting slightly with each breath of the hymn. The tall figure stood at the center, hands folded, head bowed. The chant was low, steady, not music, not words, but a sound that seemed to thrum in the chest rather than the ears. Matthew had just started to sink into its rhythm when a sharp crack shattered it. It was the sound of someone gasping too loudly. A novice at the far side of the hall, a boy no older than 20, had dropped his head into his hands, rocking forward on his knees. His breathing was ragged, his voice cracking with words that made no sense. The sisters moved instantly. Two veils blurred across the floor, reaching him before anyone else could. Their hands clamped onto his shoulders, pulling him upright. He screamed, not in pain, but in defiance. Words spilled from his mouth, jagged and frantic. "There my sleep. I saw the doors, I opened one." The rest was cut short by the tall figure raising a single hand. The boy's body went rigid. His eyes went wide. A tremor ran through him from head to toe, like something beneath his skin was trying to claw its way out. And then the chanting began again, but it was different now, slower, heavier, directed entirely at him. The sound poured over him like molten lead. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes rolled back until only the whites showed. Matthew realized the boy was not just hearing the chant. He was absorbing it, his mind being rewritten in real time. When it ended, the boy collapsed. The sisters did not comfort him. They lifted him like an empty vessel and carried him toward a door in the back of the hall, a door Matthew had never seen open before. Just before it closed, the boy's eyes flicked toward Matthew. They were blank, hollow. Whatever he had seen, whatever he had been, was gone. The tall figure turned to the novices and spoke for the first time in hours. "Those who opened the wrong door," the voice said, "never return through it." They came for him in silence. Two sisters entered his cell long after midnight, their steps muffled by the cold stone floor. No words, no gesture, just the slow lowering of their heads in unison, and Matthew knew there was no choice in what came next. He rose without speaking, and they fell in behind him, one on each side. The corridor felt narrower than usual, the air thicker, the torches burning lower. Every shadow seemed to lean inward, watching. They led him past the refectory, past the novices' quarters, past the library door with its iron clasp. They kept walking until the air grew colder still and the walls began to drip with condensation. And then the door. It was taller than a man, built of blackened wood banded in rusting iron. No handle, no keyhole, just a faint spiral carved into its center. The same spiral he'd seen in his dreams, the one that had pulsed behind his eyes when the sisters' voices pressed into his thoughts. One sister stepped forward and placed her palm on the spiral. The wood shuddered, not like a door opening, but like something breathing. Slowly it swung inward. What lay beyond was not lit by any flame. A faint green glow leaked from somewhere unseen, casting long, warped shadows along the floor. The air was warm and wet, tasting faintly of iron. They pushed him forward. At first, he thought it was a corridor, but the walls weren't stone. They were rough, fibrous, damp to the touch. The sound of dripping echoed from all directions. With each step, the green glow grew stronger, until it revealed a space so vast it could not possibly fit within the abbey's foundation. Figures hung from the walls, not chained, not bound, embedded. Their bodies half swallowed by the fibrous mass, their faces slack and pale, their chests rising and falling in slow, unnatural rhythm. Their eyes were open. Every one of them stared at Matthew. The sisters stopped behind him. The tall figure emerged from the shadows ahead, the green light limning the edges of the veil. "This," the voice said, low and even, "is where the doors truly lead." The walls seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. Or maybe it was his heartbeat that had started following theirs. Matthew tried to step back, but the sisters behind him didn't move. The space between them and the wall of living flesh was suffocatingly small. The tall figure stepped closer, the green glow spilling across the folds of the veil. "These," the voice said, "are not prisoners." The nearest figure's eyes shifted, tracking Matthew's face. Its lips moved, just barely, and a thin hiss of breath escaped. Not a word, but a sound that seemed to press against the inside of his skull. "They are vessels," the tall figure continued. "Those who have given themselves fully. They no longer hunger, no longer doubt. They are joined to the root." Matthew's gaze darted from one embedded form to another. Some looked decades old, skin shrunken over bone. Others looked freshly taken, their eyes still wet with tears. And yet, all breathed in the same rhythm, slow, deep, as if their lungs drew air from the same source. They do not speak because words are crude. They do not walk because the root walks for them. They are not alone, for they are one. The sister at Matthew's left leaned close, her whisper hot against his ear. To enter is to ascend. To refuse is to rot outside the root. One of the embedded figures suddenly convulsed. Not in pain, in joy. Its eyes widened, and its mouth stretched in a smile too wide for its face. The walls swallowed it deeper, until only the face remained, fused to the pulsing surface. Matthew's stomach turned. He took a step back and hit the unyielding bodies of the sisters. The tall figure reached out a gloved hand and touched the spiral scar on his chest. Instantly, his heartbeat synchronized with the rhythm of the wall. He felt a faint pull, not on his body, but on his will, a slow unraveling of resistance. Outside, the voice said, "You will break yourself trying to be whole." Inside, "You will never be broken again." The embedded faces all smiled at once. The pull from the wall grew stronger, as if invisible threads had hooked into his chest and were reeling him in. Matthew kept his eyes down, focusing on the damp floor, on anything but the faces staring from the pulsing surface. But then a voice, not the chanting, not the whispers of the sisters, a voice from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Matthew, his head snapped up. There, halfway down the wall, the green glow framing its features, was a face he knew as well as his own. Elias, not the boy he had met in the abbey, not one of the novices. Elias from before, from the village, from the winters when they huddled around the same fire and swore they would never bow to anyone. His friend, his brother in all but blood. But the eyes that met his now were wrong. They were soft, dreamy, empty of the sharp defiance that had once burned in them. "Come inside," Elias whispered. "It's so much easier." Matthew staggered back, hitting the sister's grip. His mind rebelled. Elias had vanished years ago. The rumor was that he'd fled across the northern pass. Others said he drowned. But here he was, half swallowed by a living wall beneath the abbey. "What did they do to you?" Matthew hissed. Elias's smile was slow, patient. "They took away the noise, the choices, the hunger. You can't imagine the peace until you've given everything." The tall figure moved closer, and for a moment, the green glow caught on the curve of their jaw beneath the veil. "He came to us willingly," the voice said. "They all do in the end." Elias's eyes pleaded. "Don't fight it, Matt. The root will take the weight from you." Matthew realized his own breathing had fallen into sync with the wall again, the rhythm seeping into his blood. His resistance was crumbling, not through fear, but through the seductive pull of rest. The sisters stepped aside, just enough to let him choose. Forward, into the wall, or back, into the cold corridors of the abbey, where the chanting would find him anyway. Elias's smile widened. Matthew's pulse thundered in his ears, but the rhythm of the wall was starting to win. It wasn't just matching his heartbeat anymore, it was leading it. Every inhale felt softer, heavier, more inevitable. The sisters stood like statues, their eyes on him, but their hands no longer holding him. They thought the root was doing the work, and maybe it was. But Matthew still had one weapon left, the thing the abbey had never beaten out of him: patience. He let his shoulders drop, let the tension slide from his jaw. He fixed his eyes on Elias's and softened them, letting his friend see what he wanted to see. "You're right," Matthew said quietly. "I'm tired." The sisters moved closer, as if to steady him, but the tall figure raised a hand. "Let him come on his own." Matthew took a step forward. The wall's heat washed over him, humid and heavy, like standing too close to a dying animal. Threads, no roots, shifted inside the surface, questing toward him. They pulsed in time with the green light. Elias's grin spread into something almost beatific. One more step, Matt. Just one. Matthew swallowed hard and stepped closer, until the damp fibers brushed against his chest. They were warm, almost tender. A root slid over his collarbone and coiled gently around the back of his neck. He kept his breathing slow, even his face relaxed. Inside, his mind raced. He counted the sisters' positions in his peripheral vision, noted the tall figure's stance, the way the green light dimmed when they moved closer to the wall. A second root curled around his wrist, testing, tasting. Matthew let it. He leaned in, placing his forehead against the wall, hiding his eyes so no one saw the truth in them, that he was awake, sharper than he'd ever been. Because if the Abbey had a secret this deep, then somewhere, behind all this pulsing flesh and ritual, there had to be a weakness. And he was going to find it, even if it meant letting the root pull him deeper than he had ever dared go. The instant Matthew's skin fully touched the wall, the world around him bled away. The cavern, the sisters, even the smell of damp earth dissolved into blackness shot through with pulses of green light. He wasn't standing anymore. He was drifting. Something vast and patient pressed at the edges of his mind, testing the seams of his thoughts. It didn't speak in words. It didn't need to. Every pulse of green light carried meaning directly into him. Images, sensations, and fragments of memory that weren't his own. He saw a field under a blood-red dawn. Monks in black robes stood in a perfect circle, chanting as a body was lowered into the soil. The ground itself seemed to breathe, swallowing the corpse like water taking a stone. Then centuries blurred past in the space of a breath. Kingdoms rose and fell, but the Abbey remained, always feeding the root, always taking those who strayed too close. The world above changed, but the thing beneath stayed the same. Matthew felt himself pulled deeper still, into a memory so old it hurt to contain it. A time before the Abbey, before the village, when the land was nothing but a forest of colossal trees, their roots tangling so far beneath the ground they formed a single living web. The vision shifted. In the heart of that web, something moved. Not an animal, not a plant, a presence. It watched without eyes, listened without ears. It had no name, at least not one that could be spoken, but it understood hunger. It had learned to reach upward through the roots, to touch minds, to make them dig, build, worship. And somewhere in the swirl of images, Matthew saw the first sisters, pale, silent women who knelt before the ancient heart of the web and offered themselves, not as sacrifices, as bridges. The vision swelled until Matthew thought his skull would split. He wasn't just seeing the Abbey's history. He was feeling it, each century pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't shake. And then something noticed him. The green light flared. Every other image vanished. In the darkness, a single thought formed, deep and slow, and it was not his own. You are not here to escape. You are here to stay. The green light pulsed harder, each beat a pressure inside Matthew's skull. The visions of the Abbeys he passed receded, but the presence didn't leave. It moved closer, not in space, but in thought. He felt it turn toward him, and then it began a search. It wasn't like someone rifling through a chest of drawers. It was more like a tide creeping over a shoreline, slow and unstoppable, seeping into every crevice. Images from his own life began to surface without his permission. He tried to hold them back, but the more he resisted, the faster they came. His father's voice, low and bitter, telling him he'd never be more than another mouth to feed. The night he found Elias gone, the fire in the hearth burned down to embers. The winter he'd stolen bread from the old woman on the edge of the village, knowing she wouldn't live to see spring. The roots seemed to taste each memory, linger on the ones that stirred the most shame or regret. And with each memory, it whispered in feelings, not words. We can take this from you. We can make it stop. A memory he hadn't thought of in years bubbled up, one that didn't feel like it belonged here, in this place of earth and roots. It was the night of the flood. He'd been a boy, standing on the riverbank, and he'd watched the black water carry something past. A shape too big to be an animal. It had eyes that caught the moonlight and didn't blink. He'd never told anyone, not even Elias. The root lingered there, tasting the fear from that night like a predator scenting blood. Matthew felt panic rise. If it could see everything, it could use everything. And the more it knew, the harder it would be to keep his deception alive. He needed a wall. A thought so sharp and dangerous it would cut the root if it tried to take it. But the sisters were moving now, their veils brushing the damp floor as they closed in. The tall figure's voice cut through the pounding in his head. His mind bends. Soon, the root will keep him. And Matthew, despite the pain, forced himself to smile. Matthew knew if he tried to fight the root head-on, he'd lose. It wasn't a contest of strength. It was a contest of attention. So he gave it something to chase. He built the memory in his mind like a craftsman shaping a trap. Every detail sharp, every sensation vivid. A hidden door beneath his childhood home. Steps descending into a stone chamber. A locked iron box on a pedestal. Inside, wrapped in black cloth, something the Abbey would want more than anything else. A relic that could sever the root from its sisters. None of it was real. But he made himself believe it for the moment, flooding his senses with the smell of cold stone, the weight of the iron key in his palm, the dust motes drifting in the air. The presence in his head hesitated, as if tasting the edges of this new offering. Then it moved toward it. Good. He let the memory expand, added faint whispers around the box, a sense of heat radiating from the cloth, just enough to make it irresistible. The root's pressure grew sharper, more focused. He could feel it burrowing deeper, trying to pull the image apart to see if the box was real. But the beauty of a lie was in its imperfections. He let the vision slip, just enough to suggest secrecy, danger, something worth hiding. That would keep it hooked. In the physical world, the damp, pulsing chamber, Matthew's lips moved, whispering nonsense syllables, as if reciting an incantation from the false memory. The sisters leaned in, eager, their bodies rigid. The tall figure's voice was low, urgent now. He knows something. Matthew kept his breathing slow, masking the satisfaction curling in his chest. The root was distracted, which meant for the first time since he touched it, his real thoughts were his again. He used that thin sliver of freedom to scan the chamber, to count distances, to mark exits, because he knew this would not last long. In the back of his mind, he felt the root closing in on the false box, prying at it, desperate to see what was inside. When it found nothing, it would rage. And rage could be just as useful as hunger. The moment came like a storm breaking. One instant, the root's attention was buried in the false memory. The next, it snapped back, a cold, tearing sensation, as if claws had raked through the inside of Matthew's skull. It had seen the lie. The chamber around him warped, shadows twisting unnaturally along the walls. The green glow flared so bright it stabbed his eyes, and the earth beneath his feet trembled. The presence was no longer patient. It was angry, and its anger didn't come as words. It came as an instinctive drive to crush. A pressure bore down on Matthew's chest, making it impossible to breathe. The taste of iron filled his mouth, and he realized he was bleeding from his nose. The sisters reacted instantly, their veils snapping toward him as if caught in a wind that didn't touch the air. They moved in unison, their hands rising, palms outward. Something in their posture told him that if they reached him, he wouldn't just be restrained, he'd be gone. He forced himself to step back, but the floor was shifting beneath him, the roots moving like serpents. One coiled around his ankle, tightening with bone-cracking strength. Through the haze of pain, he clung to a single thought. Rage is predictable. Rage makes mistakes. If the root wanted him crushed, it would focus everything on the attack. That meant there might be gaps in its control, moments it couldn't hold everything at once. He glanced toward the far end of the chamber where a narrow opening split the wall. It was barely wide enough for a man to slip through, and half choked with roots. If he could break the one on his leg in time. The tall figure's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and furious. Do not harm him. He is chosen. But the root didn't care. Its hunger was louder than her command. The pressure in Matthew's chest spiked until stars burst in his vision. The green light began to flicker, almost strobing, and he felt something huge and formless pressing closer, about to enter his mind again. Not to search this time, but to erase. The root's attack had a rhythm. It wasn't obvious at first, a constant, crushing pressure, but beneath the agony, Matthew felt it. A pulse. Like a heartbeat. A beat it couldn't help but follow. He timed his breathing with it, shallow, ragged, waiting for the moment between pulses when the pressure eased by a fraction. That fraction would have to be enough. The roots around his ankle were alive, flexing, tightening. He could feel the grain of them against his skin, the slick dampness where sap leaked through. He forced himself not to struggle yet. Struggling would only make them constrict harder. Another pulse. Another fraction of release. He filled his lungs just enough, then exhaled sharply and twisted, driving the heel of his boot into the root's thinner joint where it wrapped around itself. A crack like breaking bone echoed in the chamber. The root recoiled, hissing in a way that wasn't sound, but vibration through the floor. The gap was open for only an instant, but he moved. He sprinted toward the narrow slit in the wall, ducking low as other roots lashed for him, their tips barbed like hooks. One grazed his shoulder, tearing through cloth and skin, but he didn't slow. Behind him, the sisters cried out, not in fear, but in something closer to prayer. They weren't trying to stop him now. They were calling to the root, urging it to finish him. The tall figure's voice rose above them, shrill with fury. Do not let him leave. The slit was closer now. The green light faltered, stuttering like a dying lantern, throwing the chamber into momentary darkness between flashes. Each time the light returned, the opening seemed narrower, the roots denser, as if the abbey itself was trying to close the way. Matthew dug the last few feet, hitting the earth hard, rolling to keep momentum. Roots slammed into the ground where his head had been a second earlier. He slipped into the slit, the world tightening around him. Roots scraped his back, toward his arms, but he forced his way through until the chamber's roar became a distant hum. And then silence. The silence was not relief. It was the kind that listens. Matthew staggered forward, his hands brushing cold stone. The slit behind him had already sealed, not with roots, but with solid wall. No way back. The air was different here. Heavy. Metallic. Every breath tasted like old coins and blood. The darkness wasn't empty. It felt occupied. A faint glow began to spread from ahead. Not green this time, but a deep, pulsing crimson, the color of veins seen through flesh. It lit the corridor in trembling waves, as if it were not light at all but a heartbeat. He followed it because there was no other choice. The passage opened into a small, circular chamber, and there, at its center, was the thing the Abbey had built everything around. It wasn't a root. It wasn't even entirely physical. It was a heart, vast, ancient, suspended in the air by nothing, each beat sending ripples through the air like heat. Its surface was slick and glistening, but patterns moved beneath it, faces fleeting and contorted, pressing against the inner walls as if trying to scream. He recognized one of them, his own. The realization hit cold. This was not where the root ended. This was where it began. The sisters weren't feeding the thing in the chamber above. They were feeding this. Every thought taken, every will broken, every mind erased became another pulse in its endless rhythm. And now, it knew he was here. The heart's beats quickened. The faces beneath its surface turned toward him in unison, their mouths opening in silent invitation. The chamber's walls began to contract, not with roots, but with muscle. A voice rose in his skull, deeper than the root, deeper than the sisters, the voice of the Abbey itself. You came to escape, but you're already inside me. The floor shifted, tilting him toward the heart. The air thickened into something that clung, pulling him forward with every breath. He dug his fingers into the stone, but it crumbled like ash under his grip. The heart's glow filled his vision until there was nothing else, its rhythm forcing his own pulse to match. And in that moment, Matthew understood the truth. The Abbey never wanted to keep its secrets. It wanted them to spread. Through him. Through everyone. The last thing he saw before the crimson swallowed him was his own face, smiling from inside the heart.